What's going on? Jake here with Uncommon EDC. Today we're checking out the Benchmade Shootout. This is a double action out the front automatic in a special run of dark purple, which I think looks stellar. I love the way the matte purple on those grivery handles pairs with that high gloss purple on the various accessories. I think they just complement each other really well. Now this one comes to me by way of the Apex Pass Around group, and more specifically, this is part of Zach's Stuff's personal collection. So huge shout out to him for sharing this one with the group. Make sure to show him some love as well. Now you can pick up this version for $375, which is definitely on the spendy side, even compared to some other US made out the front autos from other big brands like Microtech, Heretic. I think kind of in the conversation, in terms of my collection, this wouldn't be the most expensive out the front auto I would own, but it's definitely on the higher end of it at that $375 price point. And that's a big part of why I wanted to check it out. I don't own any Benchmade out the front autos, but I do have a growing out the front auto collection, so really just wanted to see how they compare. I do have a 9400, but that is an out the side auto, so I have handled some older ones like the Infidel and things like that, and to be honest wasn't super impressed with either the action or the misfires on those. But after handling this one for a couple of days, it definitely seems like they took what they learned from those older models and applied them to the newer models, because this one actually definitely stands up against the rest of my collection. There's things that I like more about it, some things that I like less about it, but it definitely is in that conversation with the rest of them. So they did a pretty good job on this overall, I'd say. At 8.22 inches in overall length, this is definitely a full size out the front. The way that breaks down is 3.51 inches on this Tonto style blade. Beautiful blade on here, nice flat grind, fairly minimal branding. Of course, we have the Benchmade butterfly on the show side. Flipping over to that back side, the steel stamp, which is CPM crew wear, so great steel on this version of it as well. 4.71 inches on the handle, so of course that offers full 4-finger grip here, and I'd say overall very solid ergos. They're not perfect, but I'd say they are above average for sure. The one thing I will note on the ergos here is that I feel the pocket clip a little bit, and that's because this sticks up pretty far. It's also ultra deep carry, which is great, but I do feel it just a little bit. Nothing I would say is a hot spot at all, and overall the ergos are really good. One thing I really love about this model is the switch on here, and so I'm not sure if this is a universal switch that Benchmade is using now for their out the front models, but I find it to be extremely comfortable. It's a nice landing spot for your thumb. It's also got a perfect ramp, so you have plenty to push on when you're trying to actuate that switch. It's very difficult to slip off, but the jimping is grabby but not ultra aggressive. Sometimes on these out the fronts, especially ones with tougher action, that rough jimping can really tear apart the tip of your thumb, and so I'd say this one's very comfortable to actuate and a nice landing spot for your thumb when you have it open and you're using it. The other thing I really like are these grivery handles. Now admittedly these are probably the cheapest feeling handles compared to anything in my collection, but they do offer a great grip with this texturing here in the back 2/3 or back 3/4 or so, and then that front quarter has this grip tape type material that isn't overly aggressive, but it's pretty grabby. It's super tacky feeling, and tacky I mean in a grippy way. You can't really slide on there if you're putting any sort of pressure, and so it really grabs onto your fingers nicely without tearing them apart all that much, and so really like that portion of it as well. You have some jimping on the bottom. Overall I'd say again above average ergos on this out the front. Now, in terms of the action, that's obviously a big thing for out the fronts. I actually think this one is pretty good. It doesn't sound quite as smooth as like a Microtech or Heretic, and we can listen to that here. Actually, it's probably now a good time to pull one out. So we have a Microtech, and something about the action just sounds a little bit smoother on both my Microtechs and my Heretics. I just took one example of each, and so just sounds a little bit smoother, but it fires nicely. On the Kershaw, I'd say it's actually a little bit more comparable. And you just hear a little bit more of a mechanical sound in there. I think the mechanism is just a little bit louder on the Kershaw and the Benchmade, but does sound a little bit rougher than the Microtech and the Heretic, but feels just as smooth. And the switch, actually, I prefer a little bit over all of them that I've just showed. So I already mentioned the ergos on the switch are excellent. Also, the amount of pressure it takes to actuate it is on the lighter side, but it's not ultra light. So I kind of like that it puts up a little bit more resistance than the Kershaw, for example, which is the lightest of the bunch. but it's still light where your thumb's not going to fatigue if you're just sitting at your desk and flicking this open and close constantly, which I tend to do without the fronts when I have them near me. And so I do find the action a little bit lighter than our Microtechs, for example. This is by far the heaviest, and this is probably my lightest Microtech actually in terms of that pressure. But the switch itself on these are fairly good. I like this kind of X pyramid. It can be a little bit just kind of rough over multiple openings if you're opening this constantly. And a big part of that is because one, it's shorter, so that jumping's more aggressive. But two, it just requires so much more pressure to open and close these ones that it fatigues your thumb a lot more and leaves a lot of these impressions on your thumb, eventually tears up the tips if you're flipping it too long. Same thing with the Heretic. I actually don't have a Heretic in this class. I have a bigger one and a smaller one, so I went with the smaller. But the switch on this is still heavier, which typically the smaller out the fronts have lighter switches. Still just a little bit heavier than the Shootout. And the material on here, so we have kind of a similar pyramid shape, but instead of the X, we have this almost like toolbox texture at the top that is extremely grabby, and this fatigues your thumb even faster than the Microtech. And so definitely prefer both the amount of pressure and the switch on this Shootout, which is kind of a cool thing. And so another thing that you'll notice with out the fronts is blade play. Unless you're spending an incredible amount of money that just comes with the territory for out the front, this one is pretty minimal. So we have a little bit of side to side, very minimal front and back. There's a tad, but very, very minimal. And that's another area that it's speeding out these other competitors that are more known for their out the fronts. For example, with my Microtech, have both side to side and front and back blade play. Same thing with the Heretic, same thing with the Kershaw. I'm not going to pull them all out to show that example, but a little bit less play than the others, which again was something I was pretty surprised to see. Again, I think the big downside here is these grivery handles. They definitely feel cheaper, but another upside to them is that they're incredibly lightweight. I weighed this one in at 2.89 ounces, which is crazy light for an 8.22 inch overall length knife, especially with the internal mechanisms on this. I think is probably a little bit more than your typical just kind of out the side manual knife. You have a little bit more going on the internals here. So really impressive that they were able to get this under 3 ounces, and it feels like it. It feels ultra lightweight compared to all of those other models, which is kind of a cool thing. And so one last thing that I think is kind of an interesting thing to look at is the centering of that opening for the blade. And so you can see it's perfectly symmetrical. There's an even gap on either side before the opening for the blade. And that might seem kind of obvious, but it's actually not the norm when it comes to out the fronts. Because of that internal mechanism, usually it ends up being offset to one side, and we can see that. I'm trying not to set it down on the pocket clip so I don't do any damage to it. We can see that in all of the other models, pretty much all of my other out the fronts, they're not centered. So is that showing? Maybe it would show a little bit better with this Kershaw because it's different color. So you can see it's off to one side, and that's the case with literally all my other out the front autos. And so if you're someone who's just kind of driven crazy by small details like that, really nice detail that they managed to center this. Obviously they probably made it a little bit thicker than it needed to be in order to get that centering, but I do think it is kind of a nice detail. Also, the pocket clip is fully reversible. Nice enough pocket clip. Like I said, I felt it a little bit just because of how much it sticks up, but it is a full-size Benchmade pocket clip, has the Benchmade logo on there, and then that beautiful purple anodization. And of course it is reversible, so right or left-hand carry, which is great. One of my favorite things about this one as well is that instead of the glass breaker, they just went with a straight lanyard opening or lanyard slot here. And so you can attach your lanyard there if you'd like, but I'm just not a huge fan of glass breakers. So I love seeing that they left that off here. For whatever reason, without the fronts in particular, companies feel like they have to put the glass breaker there. So I'm really glad that they ended up leaving that off. We have US manufacturing right here at the tip as well, which of course all Benchmades are made in the US, but when it comes to out the fronts, they are required to be at least assembled in the US. And so all of the knives that I showed today are both manufactured and assembled in the US. There's obviously companies making their parts in China and then assembling them in the US, and you can usually get those a decent bit cheaper, but I thought it would be more fair comparison to show fully manufactured and assembled in the US knives when we're looking at these. But overall, I was really impressed with this. Maybe not as impressed enough to spend $375 on it still, but I think if I can get one of these under the $300 price point, I would be all over it, especially this particular colorway. I love the way this looks and turned out. So again, thanks again to Zach Stuff for sharing this one with the channel so we can check it out. Really, really cool. I believe next is going to Tim, my partner and co-host of Just the Tip. So check out or stay tuned to his channel to see his take on this knife in the future. Let me know what you think of it though down in the comments below. As usual, if you enjoyed the video, consider liking, commenting, subscribing, joining the channel as a member, checking out some of my other videos. They'll help out the channel a ton, and I hope you have a great one. Take care.